Hi, I'm Doni. I'm Trinidadian Costa Rican.
Hi, I'm Rhonda. I'm Afro-Honduran. And we are your co-hosts for Negra Como Soy.
Or I am Afro-Latina. Every Tuesday, we'll bring you the insights, perspectives, and history of the African diaspora in Latin America.
To educate, enlighten, and hopefully create a sense of belonging for you, our listeners and viewers.
Negra Como Soy is brought to you by Cultures, the global multicultural magazine. Cultures celebrates cross-cultural identity because everyone should feel like they matter. All right, I am so excited today to be here with Dr. Paulette Bethel. If you noticed, the title of our episode today is No Longer Latina. And Dr. Bethel grew up in, well, we'll let her tell you her story. I think it's one that you'll be able to relate to. And I think as we move forward in the world and our global world and how things are changing now, you'll find a lot of people around you who can relate to this story as well. So Dr. Bethel, thank you so much. ¿Qué tal? ¿Qué tal?
Okay, thank you for inviting me and having me here. Just kind of briefly, Donnie, when you and I were talking about doing the interview and you sent the title, I had a reaction and I shared it with you. And as I get into my story, I think, it will kind of highlight why I had the reluctance around the title, No Longer Latina. So my story is that in 2017, like a lot of people, I took the ancestry DNA test. And I got to tell you, I was so influenced by the guy that went from his lederhosen to his kilts that I had always heard all of these wonderful stories about all of my racial and ethnic backgrounds, and I decided I wanted to confirm or not confirm some of the stories that I had been told by my mother and my family. And so I took the test and the results came in, and like most people, I got the email that said your results are in, and I was so excited to find out what parts of Africa am I from, what parts of Europe am I from. And I opened the email and I looked, and at the time, they're always changing the format, but at that time, it was a pivotal format for me because I had already gotten a call from one of my cousins telling me about what she had discovered in hers, right? And I looked up in the upper right-hand corner of my results and it said Native American Indigenous Ancestry 0. And I looked at that and I thought, well, that can't be because my cousin just told me that her results said that she was 32% Indigenous Native American. And so I'm sitting there and I'm in someone's car, in the backseat of a friend's car, and I'm going, 32, 0, how about maybe not 32, maybe 25, maybe 20, but 0, right? And then I looked to the left, and there were groupings of maps that showed all the different places on the globe where I do have heritage. And Mexico was not circled. And I thought, well, that can't be. My grandfather's from Mexico. And so I thought, well, maybe they're really from Guatemala or some other place that sounds more exotic or less, And I looked and I realized no circles on Central America. And then I went, no circles on Central America, no circles on South America. And then I knew something was terribly wrong with my results. The short story is I then discovered that my paternity was not what I had always grown up to believe. I learned that I was no longer a Martinez. And I have to tell you, I was pretty devastated. My mother's no longer living, and so I couldn't call her and say, Mom, what the heck is this? And I began my quest, my journey to discover who I really was, and then to make sense of my shattered identity. Because what I recognized in that moment, looking at those results, it was no longer a cute, funny story about going from the lederhosen to the kilts. It was 50% of my identity blew up within about 60 seconds, right? Now, we believe there are millions of people that are experiencing this right now. And not everybody has their discovery as quickly as I did. Sometimes people begin to recognize, something's not quite right here. And other people will have someone contact them saying, I'm your half sister. that kind of thing in terms of the discovery. But in my case, because I had been made aware about the indigenous ancestry and it wasn't there at all, it gave me a pretty quick jolt. And so from there, my trying to find out, well, if I'm not a Martinez, who am I? If I'm going to change out my salsa shoes, what shoes do I switch to? I mean, I'm doing it with humor now, but back then there was nothing humorous about having your sense of self be not only impacted by the paternal identity, but where Donnie was coming from is the, finding out I'm no longer a Martinez, and what does that mean for me, right? Who am I now if I'm not that? Now, a lot of people will say, but nothing's changed. You're still the same person that you were yesterday. And to that I would go, nonsense. So yeah, that's my story, is having, and I ended up finding a community that was like a lifesaver for me, and they ended up coming with a term called NPE as an acronym for not parent expected. And the short version of that is, when I opened up the DNA, I did not expect that at all.
I mean,
Right? It was an absolute total
there's
shock.
so many things with it, because like you say, NPE, it's not the parent you expected. That alone is a big shock, even if it were the same ethnicity, right? But
Right.
then now you've lost a whole part of your culture. And when you identify with that, as you said, in humor, the salsa shoes, what kind of dancing shoes will you wear now? I don't know how I would feel, because it's such a big part of how I see myself, and the pride in my heritage, and understanding why I like certain things and what moves me. If
Mm-hmm.
if that all changed in 60 seconds, I honestly don't
Right.
know how.
Now, in this case, Donnie, because my parents divorced when I was very young, I was not raised in that culture.
And neither
Right.
was
I
I.
was,
Was I. And that's what I'm saying. I actually didn't know until probably, how old was I? Maybe 7, that my dad was Latin, right? And I
right.
instantly was very proud. Instantly was very proud of that, because my Trinidadian heritage meant so much to me growing up globally, finding out he also was from another place. It wasn't just the Latin factor, but he's from Costa Rica. I was very proud of that. So losing that in a second, I remember how proud I was in a second. How devastated would I be in a second?
And we
Right.
were just
So yes, although I was not raised in the culture, I agree with you. I was very proud of that part of my heritage. I embraced it. Um, I was always naturally rhythmic as a child, and I guess I was assuming that it was both the African influence and the Mexican influence that had me. I just loved Latin music, just kind of instinctually. So I just thought, well, that's part of my genetics, right? It was born. Um, and then I found out that actually I'm of Scottish descent, right? And so, um, yeah,
Might be related. I have some of that too.
right. And now that I'm learning more and more about who I am on the paternal side, I have been absolutely blown away by how much I am like this family I never grew up around. It's just been an amazing journey on that part to now have, like, oh, is that why I think this way or act that way,
I wonder
right? Is
too.
that why? And I grew up with half siblings, but I was always very different from them, and I assumed I was very different because of the Martinez influence. And now I know that's not
And
it,
that's where I
right?
was
and I
just
can hear
about
you.
to go. Sorry, Dr. Rhonda. I'll just say this quickly. I was just about to go there, because I know, based on our discussions, that as you grew up, you knew there were things that were different about you. And again, you assumed it was from the Martinez side. And looking back now, I think I gleaned from our conversation, you can see, oh, yes, that's what that was. And that's what this was. Yeah.
Exactly. And some of I can see now reflecting back, there were conversations that I would have with my mother or I would overhear, right? That didn't make sense to me back then, but it's kind of blow it off. But what I find interesting is all those specific conversations to this experience never left me. So on some level, my body instinctively knew for those particular incidents or conversations, they were meaningful, even if I had no idea why.
And Dr. Rhonda, you
Right.
were going to say something?
You know,
Yeah, we were talking in a
and
previous episode about, this comfort that comes with having a foundation from which to build your perspective, right? On not just yourself, but the world and how you see and view things. But I think right now, like where my mind is shifting in your storytelling is that there's also in looking for that comfort, this need to create an attachment, right, to something
right.
for your to anchor your identity. And so when you were saying, oh, I can dance and I have all of these things because of this piece of my culture, that's evidence of you trying to connect and trying to anchor to something from which to build your identity. And then when that's taken away, then now you're floating off in space like, well, where do I attach myself? How do I anchor myself? And then further evidence, as you're saying, oh, I can see, this other side of myself with this family that I'm learning about. I'm so much like them. And you're connecting in that way because of that innate need to attach and anchor. So I think if someone said that you were Japanese, then you might even be able to recognize things in that culture that you can connect to. Um, right? That you would,
Right,
yeah.
exactly. And right on point. I tell people, I've begun to work in this arena, but I tell people that a lot of what happens is your attachment has, I talked about identity disrupted, but the attachments as you described, they've been disrupted also, right? And so you're absolutely right. I can remember sitting in my husband's office in the middle of the night, tears just flowing down my face and trying to make sense of, who am I now? Right? Because that had become an existential question in reality. It was facing me. And as Donnie is aware, in the middle of that crisis, and I was indeed in crisis, I was trying to make sense of it. And before I knew it, I was developing a model, not because I was developing a model, I was on paper trying to connect the dots and make sense out of, what has happened to me. And before I knew it, and I thought I was grieving, and I do want to point this out. I thought I was grieving, but what I began to realize is what was really going on is I was deep in the midst of trauma, right? Because everything, and at that point, I can't say everything I knew, but in that moment, I was like, my world just blew apart on me, right? And before I knew it, I had some exposure to someone's trauma model. And I pulled that model out once I had that moment, and I began to look at the model and I began to make changes. And I started calling it an identity, the NPE identity disruption model. And as I shared, I didn't name it in that moment, but I did. I remember I wrote down identity disruption, right? And then later I found out, I got exposed to the Facebook community that I'm a part of, that they gave me the NPE that I put in front of it. And it was just basically going through, we talked about the cycle of grief. I came up with this cycle of trauma in this identity disruption experience. And I now recognize that this is applicable across so many experiences, including like the third culture kid experience, the immigrant experience, just anything that takes you from a place where you are known or you have this known identity and then you move into a different culture, then how you saw yourself in some cases, especially if it's like refugees or things like that, war torn, your identity comes into total disarray, right? And you begin to recover it and come up with new ways of seeing yourself. But I've begun to recognize that this model has broad applicability.
I wonder what the connections would be to like the adoptee community, like when people
Yeah,
find out that they were adopted.
and I love it. I knew we were running
Right.
out of time. I
Um,
definitely
In fact, a lot of the language we're using right now, we're borrowing from the adoption community as we try to develop language because there are a lot of similarities, especially when and especially when adoptees find out that they're adopted. And I'm in a Facebook group that has about 12,000 people. And within this Facebook group, we come from a variety of ways of this discovery. So some people end up discovering through taking the test for fun that they were adopted. Some people, through taking the test for fun, find out that they were donor conceived. They had no idea, right? And then within all of that, then it kind of multiplies out because all of a sudden you start recognizing, not just that I have a paternity that I wasn't aware of, but I have siblings that I didn't know I had. That's just a whole different layer of experience. And so people who are donor conceived, they may find out that they've got lots and lots of siblings. I don't know if that makes sense, but
It makes
yes.
a lot of sense. We unfortunately are running out of time, and everything you're saying is fascinating. So I personally would like to invite you back specifically to talk about the NPE model. We could talk more about adoption and some of the things that people may not think of when your identity isn't disrupted and your family is disrupted like that. But before we do that, I would like to ask you about, because, being Latina or Latinx, people, there are certain things, almost like with the African American community too, they expect you to eat certain food and they expect you to talk a certain way and dance and dress a certain way, whatever the case may be. I think in the Latin community, often it's like, oh, do you speak Spanish? You're not really Latin enough, that kind of thing. So, and I don't know if you agree with this, Rhonda, also your appearance, like, oh, well, you don't look Latin. Why are you trying to claim this identity? So now that this has happened, and being that that's already part of that community, how how do you feel? Like, how do you identify now, and how have you reconciled to move forward?
Okay, so one thing, Donnie, is I always perceived that I had a Latin appearance. No, I recognize I wasn't 100%, but I always perceived when I would go to Mexico, people would be speaking Spanish to me. When I would go in to more, where there was more of a Latin culture, then I would very often be approached and I would end up saying, no habla español, right? And people would be surprised that I didn't know the language. And so for the longest, when I looked in the mirror, I saw this woman who had Mexican heritage, right? And then one day, in the discovery is this, I did look in the mirror one day. It took me a while to look and see it. And then I recognized I don't see the Latin heritage anymore, right? And so some of it is in terms of our perceptions about who we are. If I've been told a story that I'm a Martinez, then I'm going to look for all of the markers for being part of that culture, part of that heritage. Now, I do have Spanish and Portuguese heritage on my mother's side, right? So it's not totally out of the picture, but in terms of that strong identity to the Mexican heritage, I ended up, and I have not thrown away those things that I embraced about that culture because they really are a part of me experientially. Right? It's just having that awareness that it is no longer a part of my ethnic heritage and identity in the way I had believed or had been told.
Fascinating. Well, I cannot wait for us to chat again and really delve more deeply into this. Thank you so much for
All
sharing.
right. Thank you for
Thank
having
you so
me.
much for coming on.
A pleasure. A pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Cultures is thrilled to bring you the best of cross-cultural identity through highlights of the African diaspora in Latin America. Want more? Support us with a subscription that includes 3 annual deliveries of media, products, and experiences to embolden your cross-cultural identity and ensure you live in full color. Subscribe today at culturesmag.com/subscribe.